A child's crown, delicate, worn, cracked, lay forgotten amidst the dust of a once glorious palace. Once it had been a symbol of power, of destiny, but now it sat lifeless, abandoned in the ruins of time. The stones of the palace, cold and decaying, had witnessed the rise of empires, the fall of kings, and the fleeting reign of a child who never had the chance to understand what it meant to rule. Married at 6, widowed at 10. The crown was heavy for a head so small, a burden too immense for Innocence to bear. She was meant to rule an empire, to ascend to greatness, but instead she was swallowed by the weight of a world built for men. The world that saw her as a pawn, an object of power struggles, a mere tool in the hands of fate and politics. Her name, once whispered with reverence in the courts of kings, would soon fade from history. Her face, once radiant with the promise of a future that never was, would become a shadow lost to time. In the annals of history she would be forgotten, an echo of a tragic tale never fully told, never understood. And so, we ask, was this her fate, carved by cruel hands, or was it fate's dark joke, the child queen who became a widow before she even knew love, before she even had the chance to learn what it meant to wear the crown, to make decisions, to hold power? What happens when a child is made to carry a crown that is too heavy for her? What happens when a kingdom is built on the back of innocence, and that innocence is destroyed before it ever gets the chance to live? At 6 years old, Eleanor of Aquitaine was a queen, not in spirit but in fact crowned and wed to the young King Louis VII of France in a political arrangement not born from love, but from the cold necessity of power. Her beauty, her grace, her lineage, all were shields wrapped in silks too heavy for her small frame. Yet to the world she was radiant, untouchable, a crown perched upon her head, though she had not yet learned the weight of it. At such an age, dreams should be made of running barefoot through meadows, not pledging loyalty to a kingdom that knew no innocence. But Eleanor did not live a child's life. She lived as an instrument, a piece of an ever-shifting puzzle, forced to grow up too soon, her youth buried beneath layers of courtly obligation. The politics of Europe demanded more than beauty. They demanded strength and submission, cunning and sacrifice. At court she was not just the future queen, but a symbol of wealth, of alliance, of dynasty. To the kingdom she was the very promise of peace and power, draped in velvet, not in the soft innocence of youth. Her rise was as much a matter of birth as it was of circumstance. She had inherited one of the most powerful and wealthy regions in all of France. In a world where power often tasted like blood, Eleanor's future was one of promise. Yet, she did not rise alone. She rose amidst the political scheming of men, who were too eager to use her as a pawn, while never letting her touch the board herself. Her child, a bride, an emblem of peace, Eleanor rose to power, but not on her own terms. What happens when a child, born to wear a crown, is forced to wear it before she understands the weight of it? The rise of Eleanor was swift, but it was also fragile. The promise of a glorious reign began to crack under the strain of a marriage that was never hers to control. At 10, Eleanor had already learned the sharp taste of loneliness in a union, not based on love, but on political duty. King Louis, pious, introspective, and weak in his resolve, could not match the fiery will of his young queen. His devotion to the church overshadowed her intellect, and his inability to lead the kingdom left Eleanor aching for the life she had not chosen. Louis, unable to understand the depths of her spirit, grew distant, disillusioned. He sought absolution in prayer, while Eleanor sought meaning in the duties of a queen, duties that were rendered meaningless by a marriage founded on misaligned desires. The gulf between them widened, and the tension became unbearable. She was the queen of a fractured empire, woman of strength and intelligence shackled by a man who could not keep her reign intact. As Eleanor's mind awakened to the weight of her station, her ambition grew. She began to see her marriage not as a sacred bond, but as a prison. The pressure of the throne pushed her to the brink. A turning point came when her marriage to Louis reached its breaking point. In a decisive moment of frustration and self-preservation, Eleanor challenged the very institution she had pledged herself to. In an era where women were meant to stand quietly behind their husbands, Eleanor sought the courage to step forward, Her desire for true power, her need to be seen, heard, and valued, finally became undeniable. Yet as the years passed, Eleanor's pursuit of her own destiny was met with resistance not only from her husband, but from the very kingdom she had once thought she would inherit. Her marriage crumbled, and in its ashes, she saw the fire of rebellion burn bright within her. Was this her destiny? A rebellion born of frustration, or a fatal mistake made in the name of love? The moment Eleanor's marriage to Louis VII dissolved, so too did the illusions that had kept her tethered to the gilded cage of royal duty. What followed was not freedom. It was a descent into the abyss of political warfare, betrayal, and scandal. Eleanor, once seen as the shining jewel of France, now found herself at the heart of a growing storm. The kingdom she had once served so dutifully turned on her, seeing only a woman who had cast aside the bonds of her sacred marriage. To the public, she was no longer a queen, but a renegade, an enemy of the church, a threat to the stability of the throne. Her beauty and intelligence, once celebrated, became weapons used to tarnish her reputation. Her very existence, it seemed, was a political maneuver in a game of power she no longer controlled. She sought to rise, but the kingdom was not ready to let her rise on her own terms. Eleanor's marriage to Henry II of England, while initially promising, plunged her deeper into a web of deceit and political manipulation. Henry, an ambitious and determined ruler, demanded not just loyalty, but submission. Eleanor's voice, once unshackled, became a whisper beneath his reign. Her power diminished in the face of her new husband's insatiable appetite for control. The court of England was no kinder than the one in France. The political intrigue, the betrayal by family members, the constant tension between Eleanor and Henry, these things weighed on her like chains. Her sons, once the pride of her heart, were used as pawns in her husband's schemes, further alienating her from her own family. Eleanor became a prisoner of her circumstances, and the walls of her confinement grew ever higher. What had begun as a journey to reclaim her power had now become a struggle for survival. As she languished in the court of England, Eleanor's spirit, once unbreakable, began to show cracks. She fought silently, watching the years pass as the weight of her unfulfilled promise settled like ash upon her soul. What is left of a woman who has lost everything but her will, and when the world around her has turned to stone, how can she ever be free again? Eleanor's body, once radiant, once full of the fire of youth and ambition, now betrayed her. Her health, long fragile under the pressure of a life lived in constant political warfare, began to crumble in earnest. The years of emotional strain, of being forced into submission by men who saw her as nothing more than an object of their will, had taken their toll. Her hands, once steady and precise, trembled as she clasped the letters from her sons. Her once vibrant face began to show the deep lines of grief, lines not carved by time but by loss, by unfulfilled promises, by a life spent in battle with the very forces that should have supported her. Eleanor's body seemed to wither under the weight of the world. Her strength, once a force to be reckoned with, now seemed to drain from her, leaving her pale and frail. The soft glow of youth, the very essence that had made her the most sought-after woman in Europe, had dimmed. She was still a queen, but she was no longer a woman of power. She had been replaced by an older, wearier figure, whose eyes bore the scars of every battle fought and lost. The constant scheming at court, the whispered betrayals, the never-ending tension with Henry, all had eroded her once strong resolve. Eleanor had spent years fighting for her own autonomy, for her right to wield power, but with every passing year she saw that power slip further from her grasp. And now, in her later years, she could feel her body betraying her as well. Her health failed her, one ailment after another. Her once beautiful skin turned pallid, her once strong limbs stiffened, and her breath grew labored. Her sons, the very reason she had fought so hard, were now distant, each one drawn into their own affairs, each one chasing their own dreams of power. They were no longer the children who had once gazed at her with admiration. In their eyes, she saw not the woman who had birthed them, but a shadow of the queen she had once been. When the soul is worn so thin by years of fighting, what happens to the body that carries it? And when the woman who once ruled with grace is left with only the remnants of a broken life. Is there still a place for her in the world? Eleanor's final days were not marked by regal processions, nor by the soft whispers of mourners at her bedside. Her death was a quiet, almost unnoticed affair, for the world she had once ruled with such vigor had already moved on. Her spirit, once so unyielding, now drifted in a shadow of what it had been. The weight of her years, the agony of her lost battles, the unresolved grief of a life spent in political combat, all of it had worn her down until nothing remained but the slow, inevitable march toward death. The room where she lay was still. No grand ceremonies, no cries of sorrow. The court was far away, too preoccupied with their own ambitions to acknowledge the dying queen. Only a few loyal servants remained, their faces blurred by time, their hands trembling as they tended to her. Her breath came in shallow gasps, each one a reminder that life had been a cruel and unforgiving master. The fire that had once burned, so brightly within her, had now been reduced to the flickering light of a candle slowly guttering out. Her body, once a vessel of power, now seemed fragile. Her hands, which had once shaped kingdoms, lay limp by her sides. Her once sharp eyes, filled with determination, now stared vacantly at the ceiling, as if searching for something that had long since vanished. The room grew colder, as if the world itself was indifferent to her departure. In those final moments, Eleanor did not speak. She did not beg. She did not struggle. She simply surrendered. The queen who had defied empires, who had loved, fought, and lost so many times, finally succumbed to the one thing that had always been beyond her control, death. And as her body lay still, the world continued, unaware of the woman who had once held it in her hands. What does it mean when a queen dies, not with a roar, but with a sigh? When a lifetime of power, of loss, and of battle ends in silence? Does the world remember, or does it move on, unmoved by the passing of those who shaped it? When Eleanor of Aquitaine died, the world did not stop to mourn her as it should have. Her passing was swallowed by the demands of an ever-unstable kingdom, where her sons scrambled for power and her husband Henry II shifted his attentions to newer battles. The court, which had once buzzed with her presence, now turned its focus toward new ambitions. Eleanor was gone, but the crown continued its cruel dance, and her legacy was quickly buried beneath the weight of time. Her death was not an event to be commemorated. No grand funeral procession marked the end of her reign. There were no eulogies delivered by those who had once sought her favor. Her body was interred quietly, as though her name had already been forgotten by the very people she had once ruled. Hoover, Henry II, who had spent years keeping her in a fragile political cage, allowed her burial to pass without fanfare. Her sons, who had grown up in the shadow of her greatness, continued to battle for their own dominions, too consumed by their own ambitions to reflect on the queen who had borne them. But the true injustice lay in how history erased her. Eleanor was buried beneath the records of her husband and sons, relegated to the margins of the chronicles, overshadowed by their actions. Her influence, her strength, and her legacy were reduced to mere footnotes. For a woman who had once commanded armies, who had ruled both as a queen and as a mother, her death was little more than an afterthought. Yet, beneath the surface of history's rewriting, Eleanor's shadow remained. In the hearts of those who had seen her fight, in the whispers of those who had heard her name spoken in reverence, she continued to haunt the corridors of time. History may have buried her, but the mark she left would never be fully erased. When the world forgets a woman's worth, who will remember? And how many stories must be rewritten before the voices of those who shaped them are finally heard? Eleanor of Aquitaine was many things: a queen, a mother, a lover, a prisoner. She was a woman who had defied the conventions of her time, fought for her own agency, and carved a place in the annals of history that should have been secure. But in death, she was forgotten. The crown she had worn so fiercely was passed on to others. The throne she had held in her heart was overtaken by her sons, and the power she had commanded was diluted by the generations that followed. In the end, it was not the kings she had helped crown who would remember her, but the women she had inspired. Eleanor's legacy is not written in the grand halls of kings, nor in the chronicles of men. It is woven into the lives of women who even now fight to hold their power in a world that continually asks them to be silent. She lived in an era when women were not meant to rule, but she did. She lived in a time when they were meant to be seen and not heard, but she spoke. Her marriage to Louis VII, though unsuccessful, was a statement of her independence. Her marriage to Henry II, though fraught with struggle, was a testament to her strength. She was never merely a queen, she was a force of nature, reshaping the world around her, even when it seemed that the world was doing its best to crush her. The greatest irony of Eleanor's life is that she was often remembered for the mistakes she made, her marriage to Louis, her political schemes, her battles with Henry. But what if those mistakes were the very things that made her human? What if they were the proof of her struggle? In an age where a woman's worth was measured by her ability to bear children and remain silent in the presence of men, Eleanor's courage to defy that expectation is perhaps her greatest achievement. She refused to fade into the background. She refused to be a mere pawn in a political game. Her legacy lives not in the victories she secured for her sons or in the power she wielded as queen. Her legacy lives in the fight for space at the table, the fight that continues today, where women still ask for a seat at the table and demand that their voices be heard. She remains an icon of resilience, a reminder that even in a world that sought to silence her, she still found a way to speak, through her deeds, her actions, and her spirit. Eleanor may have died quietly, but the world she left behind was anything but silent. The mark she left on history is indelible. Her influence reverberates in the bloodline she created, the lands she once ruled, and in the very spirit of women who continue to break barriers and build legacies of their own. When a woman's life is erased from history, does she disappear? Or does she linger in the spaces between what is remembered and what is forgotten? Eleanor's story lives on, not in the history books, but in the strength of every woman who rises to be more than the world expects her to be.